sermon series on the 5 practices for fruitful living. I'm the vine, you are the branches. The basic premise is then that Jesus wants you and me as his followers to flourish as we live together. Jesus and his disciples had certain fundamental practices that Jesus lived as an example before them, and they continued to practice with Jesus, and they continued to practice as they became the early church. Fundamental practices to maintain a connection with God so that they might flourish. And that these practices would as well motivate them to relieve the burdens of other people that restrain them from flourishing in their relationship with God. These fundamental practices, we're reviewing some of them in this 5-part series. We talked about radical hospitality in the first week. And by radical hospitality, what we learned is it's our opening our hearts and lives to the presence of God with welcoming acceptance in our lives, more and more opening ourselves each minute of each day of our lives so that God lives in us. We then said, because of that, passionate worship results, because the more and more God comes to live in our lives, the more and more we want to return that love to God. And we do that in passionate worship. We get together and we do that in public, and we also take it home from church, and we do it in private as well, because we want to continue to build that relationship with God. So God extends love to us in radical hospitality. We extend love toward God's reaching out toward us in passionate worship, which brings us to the third natural step, and that is when we're doing those two things, we want to delve more deeply into our connection and our relationship with God. We want to grow more and more in the grace and knowledge of God through Jesus Christ. We want to become more and more Christ-like. Radical hospitality, passionate worship, intentional faith development. We've called these practices. Let's review again what a practice is. Just a basic practice. All of us have basic practices in our life. It's an activity that we repeat over and over again, and we deepen over time in order to ingrain something in our lives. The first week we talked about a gymnast and building all the skills that it takes to do a marvelous routine and to look effortless. Last week we talked about baseball, how young kids practice certain things and the pros practice the same things, and it looks effortless because they built the muscle memory for the various activities from the time they were little. Let me use another example of a practice that some of you have undertaken, and let me talk about typing. Did all of you arrive in this world typing 60 words a minute? Of course not. How many of you now type 60 words a minute? Okay, we've got several here that do. That's excellent. How did you learn? What was your basic practice? A, semicolon, semicolon, A, S, D, F, what? J, K, L, semicolon, or reverse that. And whatever you do with your thumbs. I don't always put my fingers in the right place, but it's because I didn't engage in that practice growing up. I didn't learn the right keys. I didn't do those practices. But in order to gain the skills and to make it look effortless, you have to practice. That's a practice. Okay. So an activity that we repeat and deepen over time in order to ingrain something in our lives. A Christian practice is an activity that we repeat and deepen over time in order to open ourselves to the work of the Holy Spirit in us. They're not steps, that once we get down the practice of radical hospitality, we're done with it, and you move on to something else. It's something that you need to practice all the way along. They're not static qualities that some people possess and other people don't. There's something that all of us need to engage in. Anyone can start at any point and begin to develop these practices with the help of the Holy Spirit. I'm believing that these practices will change our lives. Chuck read our Hebrews passage, and let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Bishop Schnase, who wrote the book, says this gives us a basic understanding of what faith development and intentional faith development is about. So let's break it down. Let's talk about faith development. What is faith development? Well, we've always used the concept of Sunday school. We've always used the concept of Christian education, and that is a limited part of faith development. Faith development is how we learn in community, a community of people, outside of our worship opportunities in order to deepen our faith and to grow in our relationship with God. It's the process of maturing from infancy in the faith to being a senior citizen in the faith, for the lack of a better idea. It's like growing up, faith development. We talk about child development. Faith development is kind of the same thing. What happens to infants and toddlers if they're not fed physically? Anybody? This is audience participation. Anytime you want to chime in, go right ahead. They don't survive. Exactly. They don't grow. They don't gain muscles. They don't gain strength. They don't gain any sort of wisdom. They don't survive. And the same thing happens with Christians who aren't fed spiritually, whose faith doesn't develop because of certain practices like feeding